Welcome to Printing on the C&P Press, the Chandler and Price. This is a big process and we're going to get started right away by putting the rollers in. One of the things I hope you'll see in this video is repetition of many of the processes. Because it's complicated, because there's so much going on, seeing this at least a few times is going to be important. You don't always need all three rollers when you're printing. Sometimes you can get away with just two depending on the size of your form. Rarely do you ever want to print with only one. Here you can see the action of the rollers, all three, going up and down the rails. Let's get in close and have a look at the left side. Because there are positions for three rollers, you typically start at the bottom. Everything is spring-loaded, so you really have to watch your fingers when you're doing this. Aside from getting the metal axle into its position, the most important part here is ensuring that those white things, which we call trucks, are sitting on the rails of the press. In just a moment here, you'll see the right-hand side. The camera makes it really difficult to see the rollers being put in their entirety. But here is the third of three rollers, the top roller. I've inserted the left side, and just out of frame, the right. So let's see the right side as well. Same thing, starting at the bottom. It's spring-loaded, so watch your fingers. You have the benefit of this small knob that sticks out on the double carriage at the top. That makes it easier to pull out to get started. You can install the rollers from the left-hand side or the right-hand side, whichever you're more comfortable with. So the next step in getting ready to print is to pick an ink. We have a lot of inks. You can take ink right out of the can, or you can mix it like any other kind of ink. A major difference here is that letterpress ink we tend to apply in relatively small amounts. So you could see the amount I had on my knife there, and then I carefully apply it to the disc on the press itself. Now, standing in the operator's position, I'll begin turning the press over by hand to get it moving, turning the large flywheel away from me or in a counterclockwise direction. And then I'll begin pumping on the press itself with my feet. This is the part that tends to screw everybody up because now you're using your hands and your leg and you're watching the press move, and it's an awful lot. The great news about using this press is that when you want to stop, you stop moving your leg. You can use your hand to reach over and slow the flywheel, but it is entirely human powered. So if you want to stop, you stop. Also, when you're first inking up the press, as we're doing here, it gives you an opportunity to test out how it moves and how you move with it without the added pressure of printing. So our press is inked up, and we've prepared a form, some type, locked inside of a chase. There's another video entirely for that process. And we place it onto the press. There are some little feet below the chase that keep it from slipping all the way through, and then that spring-loaded handle at the top that locks the chase into place. And here, as we move the press by hand, you can see how it all comes together. The inked rollers run across the form. They're then inked by the disc, which incidentally moves a little bit clockwise each time so that the ink is constantly being distributed. And the press comes together. And when on impression, the paper and the form will touch. Here you can see me controlling the press entirely with the flywheel in my left hand. And there's what our form looks like in the press, inked. So, now we have to prepare the platen. These kinds of presses are called platen presses, and they have to do with the fact that this metal table surface, which moves back and forth, will hold our paper and bring our paper in contact with our form. So starting with a piece of tympan that I fold, I can place it onto the platen by lifting up the hinged bail. That's the metal bracket at the bottom. And here, masking tape becomes our friend. So I can use masking tape to hold the tympan down on the sides as well as on the top, the part that's going to be closest to me as the operator. Now, anytime we get started printing, we need to pack the press. And a good place to start typically is one piece of heavy packing. And heavy packing in this case is just Mayfair paper that's cut to fit underneath the tympan. So a little more masking tape will hold our packing against the platen. And I should note here that I'm using masking tape right at the top and not anywhere where my form will print. Because even though masking tape is very, very thin, it'll change the pressure, and it can then ultimately change the impression that we get when we print on this press. So a bit more tape to hold the tin pin down, and we're ready to set up our registration. So here's a piece of clear mylar. It doesn't have to be perfect. It could be a used piece of clear mylar, and it has to be smaller than the platen itself, but larger than the form that we're going to be printing, and typically, ideally, larger than the piece of paper that we're going to be printing. So I'm taping a hinge onto one side so that I can swing that mylar out of the way, and then one other small piece on the opposite side to hold it in place. And now, swinging that lever forward, we'll see more of that in a moment, I will turn the wheel by hand, bringing the press together to take an impression. Now I should warn you, it's not going to be perfect, but what we are looking for is some sort of printing on that mylar. And ultimately that shows us where the form is going to print on our paper. And here is our registration proof. I took a test of the form on the small proofing press, and then I affixed it to a piece of paper that is identical to our printing paper. And here comes the magic part. We slide our registration proof under the mylar and line it up. Once we've got it lined up, and you can take as much time as you need, but once it's lined up, we'll very carefully hold our registration proof in place, pull that mylar out of the way, and then use a pencil to trace around the bottom and the two sides of our piece of printing paper. And now I can safely remove our mylar, cleaning the ink off with a blue shop towel. On the wooden outfeed table, that is the one right in front of you as the operator of the press, you'll find a little tiny ruler. This tiny ruler just happens to be the perfect thickness for setting up our gauge pins. Gauge pins are these little metal things that hold our paper in place when we're printing. So positioning my ruler on the bottom and on the side, about 4 millimeters, maybe 1/8 of an inch from the tracing of our paper, I make a mark on both sides. That mark is a couple of centimeters wide. And here you'll see the third one up close. You're only ever doing 3 of these, typically 2 along the bottom and 1 along one of the sides. So now grab your sharp X-Acto knife or your mini scalpel and let's slice. We're going to use our same ruler, and we're going to cut through the tin pin material, the waxy tin pin material, with our knife. If you happen to cut through the packing below, that's okay, but it's not really necessary. And I'm making cuts on both sides of the ruler in 3 spots on the tin pin, a total of 6 cuts, 2 per position. We'll get in close here in just a sec. Now the reason we need these little cuts is to fit our gauge pins. Gauge pins are these small metal devices that you'll find in the glass bowl. This is what they look like, and you need 3 of them to print. Now here's a major warning. You cannot use these to print polymer plates. Absolutely not. These are only for type. If you use them for polymer plates, the boxcar base will crush them. They're destroyed and it damages the base. So, you saw me opening up the little arms on the gauge pin and rock it back and forth. Even with a close-up on the video, this is something that you're going to have to experience in real life. What I'm going to be trying to do here, and hopefully in a moment we'll see other angles as well, is to slide the bottom of the gauge pin under each of the cuts that we've made on the tin pin. When I have it in position, I push the arms down and it doesn't move. Let's see this a couple of more times. This can be an extremely frustrating aspect of setting up the press, and even with a lot of practice, this doesn't always go perfectly. But the good news is you're not in a rush. If you can't get it to fit, pull it out gently and try again. And once it's in position, Put the little arms down, and that locks it in place. The little brass part is called a tongue, and it's there really to just keep the paper from moving when the press itself is in motion. The edge of your paper will butt up against the square silver part. And that's how your paper sits on the platen. And here's a still close-up. So let's go ahead and take our first impression on good paper. We're going to turn the press over by hand. It's important to turn it over by hand because if something gets caught or a crunching sound happens, we can stop before major damage is done. And here's our first impression. Let's have a look. Now it doesn't look too bad. I mean, it's quite exciting to see our type printed for the first time, but there are a few problems that I'm spotting right off the bat. The ink is a bit smudgy, which tells me there's too much ink. But some of the letters aren't printing, which tells me there's also not enough pressure. These may seem like the same problem, but they're actually different. So how do we fix that? Well, the pressure part is easy. We pull back our tympan and we're going to add another piece of Mayfair. Sometimes you'll have to add several pieces, but you always do one thing at a time and then take an impression. That's the only way to know if what you've just attempted to rectify has in fact solved your problem. The other thing that I mentioned was that there's too much ink. So the way we solve that is we move the rollers, those blue rollers that we assembled at the beginning of this process, away from the type, away from the form. So using some electrical tape, we can add 1 or 2 pieces of electrical tape along the rails of the press. I've just added some blue, and you can see there was some white before. And even though that's really thin, it's often enough to keep the rollers from squishing against the type quite so aggressively. And as a result, less ink goes down, and you get a crisper impression. So after those 2 changes, let's take another impression and see what our print looks like. Typically, the best way to figure out if things are going well is to print a few. So here you're going to see me print 3 or 4 impressions and then inspect how things are going. This is also why you start with a large stack of paper with letterpress, because you spend an awful lot of time in the make ready stage. That is getting the press ready to print perfectly. Once it's in good shape, then you can really fly. So on gray stock, different than the cream color we were using before, here's our impression. It's nice and crisp and deep and just enough ink, no smudging, and we're ready to start printing. So let's sit back and watch printing from a couple of different angles. There is no substitute for doing this yourself, and doing it for the first time is really going to have you questioning A, what kind of shape you're in, and B, if you are as capable a human being as you thought you were. Now, if you get into trouble, something is out of alignment or you don't place your paper exactly right, if you're acting quick, you can pull the lever towards you, and even though the press came together, nothing has printed. I could slow down, I could start again, pushing the lever forward, and we're back to printing. So here's another angle from above the press, and you're going to see my left hand on the right side of the screen push that lever forward. That's the impression lever, and that ensures that when the press comes together, it's going to print. When that handle is pulled back towards the operator, the form and the platen get close, but they don't actually touch. Other things to note. I'm going as slow as I need to go. I'm using 2 hands, and I've got a foot going on the press itself to keep it operating. I don't have all of my paper ready at any given time on the inboard, that is the small table that's set up a little higher, and I have my paper fanned out slightly. Here I've stopped the press, I've pulled the impression lever back towards me, and here you can see what my foot looks like when I slow down and then when I stop. Again, it's all you, so if you feel out of control, just stop. But here we are, we're going to get started again. So I'm always starting with my left hand pushing the wheel. That gets the press in motion. And then my foot starts pumping. When I'm ready to print, I put the throw-off lever away from me towards the press and begin feeding the paper. When I'm printing, My right hand is always reaching for the next sheet to print, while my left hand is hovering, waiting to remove the paper that's being printed from the platen. It can seem a little frantic when the press is moving, your leg is pumping, your hands are doing two different things, but you actually have a lot of time while the platen is open. So your left hand is always hovering just above, waiting to extract the paper. One of the biggest problems I have when I'm printing is that my hands are dry and the paper slips. A way to solve that is we have a small sponge and a shot glass with a little bit of water, and you can dip your finger in there every few impressions. It helps you to grab the paper with the least amount of touching possible. You obviously don't want your hands on the inky part, so that you can be extracting and placing paper as you go. Of course, if I need to stop, I've said this before, I just stop. When you get really good at this press, you can print 100 or 200 or more impressions in an hour. But the really wonderful thing about this press and about printmaking in general is it doesn't have to be about speed. You go as fast as you need to go to get the result you need. And of course, not squish your fingers.